Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday, the 18th of February in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the United States and Russia are set to begin peace talks, but Ukraine won't be there.
The EU and UK scramble to fund a ramp up in defence spending as America pulls back.
Plus, a miraculous escape. 80 passengers and crew survive after a Delta plane flipped over while landing in Toronto.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
America and Russia's most senior diplomats are expected to meet this morning to begin direct negotiations over ending the war in Ukraine. It's understood that a representative from Ukraine will not be attending the meeting between the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Riyadh. Yesterday, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskiy reiterated that he won't recognise any agreement reached without the country.
Ukraine is not participating. Ukraine knew nothing about it. Ukraine regards any negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine as negotiations with no result. And we cannot acknowledge any arrangements about us that were made without us.
Zelenskiy there speaking via translator after both the US and Russia clarified that Ukraine would be involved in future negotiations, although as yet it's unclear what form that would take.
Well, Ukraine isn't alone in not being invited to the meeting in Saudi Arabia. Europe is also not represented at the talks. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that they didn't want them there.
The European philosophy hasn't gone anywhere. If they're going to weasel out some cunning ideas about freezing the conflict while actually intending, as is their custom, nature and habit, to continue the war, then why should we invite them at all?
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov speaking there through a translator. According to Russia's Interfax news agency, the discussions will focus on restoration of bilateral relations, as well as the preparation of possible direct negotiations between leaders Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump.
The talks came after France's Emmanuel Macron held a hastily arranged mini-summit in Paris yesterday in response to the US president's push to rapidly end the conflict. Speaking after the gathering, the UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer urged President Trump to offer Ukraine security guarantees.
This isn't just about the front line in Ukraine, it's the front line of Europe and of the United Kingdom. It's about our national security, and I think that we need to do more. We need to step up in terms of our collective response in Europe, and by that I mean capability.
Starmer's comments and his pledge to send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine if needed came as Macron separately held talks with Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskiy on aligning with the US on ending the war. Meanwhile, Bloomberg has learned that the Trump administration is seeking details on how European allies could contribute to guarantees for Kyiv and deter Moscow in future.
As European nations scramble to fill the void left by a pullback in US security guarantees, EU states are now looking at ways to increase defence spending. Options being discussed include loosening the bloc's fiscal rules or repurposing existing funds. France's Europe Minister Benjamin Haddad is calling for unprecedented action.
You have also the European Stability Mechanism, where you have potential funds that could be redirected towards defense. We also need to all continue to step up our effort at the national level. But in the face of this emergency, I think it is time to take historic decisions. And indeed, the question of Eurobonds, for instance, is one of the mechanisms that we should be talking about, I think, in the coming days.
However, Benjamin Haddad's call for some form of joint financing faces legal and political hurdles. According to analysis by Bloomberg Economics, protecting Ukraine and expanding their own militaries could cost the continent's major powers an additional $3.1 trillion over the next 10 years.
Defence may be one area deeply affected by the new US administration, but the EU's economy is also starting to suffer from the uncertainty over US tariff plans. The European Economy Commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis, says trade tensions with the US are damaging investment. He says America's friendship can no longer be taken for granted.
The recent announcements from the new US administration shows that their commitment to the transatlantic partnership cannot be taken for granted. we regret the recently announced US tariff measures and will be ready to respond in a firm and proportionate way.
Dombrovskis there speaking after a meeting of euro area finance ministers. US President Donald Trump has cited barriers in the EU, including value-added tax, as an example of unfair trading rules that the US is looking to respond to.
Now, the UK government is contemplating budget cuts of as much as 11% as it tries to find money for defence. Bloomberg has learnt that the government is increasingly looking at its worst-case scenario for cuts. Bloomberg's James Walcock has more.
Britain's civil service is setting out its budget this summer. It looks grim. Health, education and defence are safe, but every other department has been asked to model both a real-term spending cut of 5% or a more radical 11% cut in spending. Sources have told Bloomberg the sudden need for defence funding is making those bigger cuts, which had been seen as the disaster scenario, more plausible. Although no final decision has been taken, even the small option is likely to be politically unpopular. It all adds up to show how difficult the UK's funding situation is. In London, James Wilcock, Bloomberg Radio.
18 people have been injured after a Delta Airlines plane flipped over and came to rest upside down whilst landing in high winds in Toronto. The aircraft, which was flying from Minneapolis to Canada, had 76 passengers and 4 crew on board, with no fatalities reported. The exact cause of the incident is yet to be determined, according to Fire Chief Todd Aitken.
The cause of the crash is still under investigation and being led by the Transportation Safety Board. This is an active investigation. It's really important that we do not speculate. What we can say is the runway was dry and there was no crosswind conditions.
Toronto Fire Chief Todd Aitken speaking there. This is the latest accident during a turbulent period for air safety in North America. 10 people died aboard a commuter plane that crashed in Alaska earlier this month. And in January, 67 people died after a regional jet operated for American Airlines collided with a military helicopter in Washington, D.C.
And lastly, when it comes to earnings, BHP has revealed profits for the first half of the financial year fell 23% as Chinese economic woes dampened demand for iron ore. Underlying attributable profit came in at $5.08 billion for the period. That was below the analysts' expectations of $5.39 billion. The slowdown prompted the miner to trim its interim dividend to an 8-year low, but CEO Mike Henry believes improvement is on the horizon.
The sectors of the economy that are important to BHP's commodity demand, for the most part, have been performing strongly. The exception, of course, is the property sector. That has been under some pressure, but we're starting to see some green shoots there by way of increased new starts, property price rises in some sectors. So I think we'll see some momentum building into 2026.
CEO Mike Henry there speaking to Bloomberg. He added that demand for BHP products remains strong despite global uncertainty. Those are our top stories.
On the markets on Monday, we saw European bonds sliding and defence stocks jumping on expectations of further defence spending. German 10-year yields closed 6 basis points higher. The defence company Rheinmetall surged 14%, taking its year-to-date gain to over 50%. More broadly, the Eurostoxx 50 index had its second record close in the last week. Today, we're looking at cash treasuries resuming trading after the US holiday. Yields rising there as well, 4 basis points on the 10-year to 4.51%. Australia's central bank cut its key interest rates by 25 basis points, remained cautious on further easing. Not much effect on the Aussie dollar from that as well. In Asia today, equities are rising, up 0.1% on the MSCI Asia Pacific Index. Hang Seng Tech Index, though, up by 1.7% this morning.
Those are the markets. In a moment, we will bring you more on the talks between Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov on Ukraine that are expected to begin today. But before that, a story that caught my attention. We've been talking a lot about AI. I really like the story by Parmi Olsen this morning. Why did Microsoft admit that AI is making us dumb? How is AI making us dumb? Well, apparently participants in a survey have talked about how when they trust AI for certain tasks, it means that they then don't practice those skills themselves. Things like writing and analysis and critical evaluations, a sort of atrophying of those skills, which weirdly is something that I think I've noticed with AI. you don't necessarily then kind of grapple with the core material that you might plug into an AI system.
And how much do you trust the AI
result.
to perhaps do the tricky bit of the thinking that you either don't have time to or can't do? I mean, this is analogous to does anyone know where anything is anymore? Do we just trust GPS to get us there instead? Do we remember as much about directions or the map of a place as we used to? One of the risks with this, though, Parmy Olsen writes, is that it could leave us less able to do core professional work or more vulnerable to propaganda because we're not exercising that part of our brain just as much. Is this something that AI developers need to think about as well? You know, could it prompt us to come up with our own original thoughts maybe more often?
Yes, although, I mean, the flip side of the argument, as Parmy points out, is, calculators didn't stop us all from doing maths, did they? They were they augmented things. Anyway, lots of debate around AI, of course.
Well, let's bring you more now in our top story. We're nearly 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov meeting in Riyadh today, expected to begin direct negotiations over the future of the conflict as well. This as Ukraine's president watches on along with European leaders. Joining us now to discuss, Tony Halpin, who leads our team covering economics and government in Russia and the region, and Bloomberg's EMEA News Director Rosalind Matheson is with us as well. Tony, to you first. This meeting between Rubio and Lavrov in Saudi Arabia, a country that's previously hosted Putin on a rare overseas trip. What should we be expecting?
Good morning. Well, the two sides are giving fairly different spin on what to expect from the outcome of this meeting, and the US side is casting them as exploratory talks, which are intended to establish whether Russia is serious in trying to find some resolution of the conflict. The Russian side is viewing them as an opportunity to re-establish full-blown relations with the US and together to work out some way that this conflict can be brought to an end. It's very much been a long goal to have direct talks with the US about the war in Ukraine, while sidelining Ukraine as a party to those talks. And that seems to be what's taking place today.
Meanwhile, Ros, Macron held this meeting of European leaders yesterday. How close is Europe to increasing defence spending whilst also not having a seat at this table, whether it's a negotiating table or not?
Well, that's right. And as Tony was saying, this is, for Russia, an opportunity for it to get back at the table, whereas Europe is at the door, really trying to get in and trying now to show Donald Trump that they are serious about amping up their defence spending. They are serious about European security themselves. And there was a lot of conversation at this meeting yesterday of some leaders of the EU and a lot of proposals, no doubt, discussed, but it's going to be at least a month away before all the leaders talk about them in detail. And it's unclear if that meeting is supposed to be able to make a decision or whether it's likely to get pushed off further, because there's got to be a lot of assessment around things like fiscal rules, for example, and obviously the political climate that these leaders find themselves in their own countries, and no doubt in their minds a question of how much support would voters have for a big increase in defence spending at the expense of other things in their economy, for example, and as fatigue sets in over Ukraine in general. So we are probably some way from a concrete decision in Europe, but a lot of conversation yesterday about the need to do something.
And indeed, Ukraine calling, Roz, on Europe to name an envoy for peace talks and to do so quickly. Who could that be?
Well, I was curious whether someone might self-nominate for that, and that's obviously the French president, Emmanuel Macron. He's really the one who called some of the leaders to Paris yesterday. We know he's spoken on the phone with a variety of leaders, including Donald Trump, the US president, and the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelenskiy. So he's clearly trying to be a voice for Europe in those conversations already. And you've got, obviously, less than a week from an election in Germany. It's going to be some time potentially before we have a new government there. So is Germany in a position to take the lead on this? And it's very clear that Ukraine is saying this needs to be someone at a leader level who can negotiate their way to the table. So it seems, the most likely candidate, you'd have to say at the moment, would be Emmanuel Macron.
Meanwhile, Tony, Ukraine's President Zelenskiy has been deft and, globe-trotting. He's in Turkey today. What message can he hope to deliver whilst also not actually taking part in the talks in Saudi Arabia?
Yes, he's been very clear that there can be no agreement about Ukraine without Ukraine's involvement, and that's been his line consistently. And he's been stressing again while visiting Turkey today and yesterday in the United Arab Emirates that they want clear guarantees, security guarantees, and that anything such as a fragile ceasefire, for example, would serve Russia's purposes far more than Ukraine and Europe's. So he's really trying to rally Europe behind Ukraine and to make a joint pitch to Trump not to make any commitments that would disadvantage Ukraine on the battlefield and in negotiations going forward.
And Tony, what do we know about the prospects for a meeting between Trump and Putin?
Yes, Trump said when he held his phone call with Vladimir Putin last week that they would likely meet in Saudi Arabia. And so today's talks in Saudi Arabia are adding to the speculation around that. We don't yet have any confirmation that the two leaders will meet, but it's one of the things we're looking for today. Some sign that they have enough agreement and grounds for discussion to warrant a leaders' meeting. Clearly, Putin would very much like to have a direct meeting with Trump. That would bolster his status in these talks. But Trump needs to feel that something would come out of the meeting that would justify his being there and look like a win for him. So it's a far from a done deal right now, but it's one of the things we're looking for today.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.